Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Today we welcome a local speaker, in fact a very local speaker, but one who spent a lot of his time overseas in the Indian subcontinent, David Gosling, who originally trained as a physicist, and he lectured in physics indeed for 7 years at St Stephen's College in Delhi. If you know St Stephen's College, you know this is where the elite of Indian society tend to graduate from. Dr Gosling is also ordained in the Church of England. At one time he was the director of Church and Society of the World Council of Churches, and more recently he's been the principal of Edwards College in Pakistan, which is part of the University of Peshawar, a rather active part of the world just at the moment. He's recently returned to Cambridge. He's now teaching ecology. He's written 2 books, one about ecology, both of them on the bookstall, and the one that's particularly relevant to our seminar today is Science in the Indian Tradition when Einstein Met Tagore, and there is a specially reduced version and offer of that particular book on the bookstore, which is normally £25 in paperback, or as I just discovered, £83 in hardback, but for you, only £15 today. So I will give a plug for our speaker's book today, and indeed that is also the title of Dr Gosling's seminar. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for your kind words of introduction, and thank you all. I'm grateful for this opportunity of sharing what is essentially some research I've done over a number of years on the Hindu tradition, and I'm going to concentrate on what I think is the important part of it. I could say more about the sociological side of my research, but I'm very happy to see that later in the term there is a speaker going to talk specifically about the sociology of religion. I'd like to say a word first of all about studying religion generally, because studying religions you have to have things in common across the board about religions. It's not quite the same as concentrating on one religion and on theology, and as a scientist I find I have certain preferences about the way religions are studied. First of all, I think it's important to recognise that religion and science, what do they have in common? The person who has written, to my mind, most interestingly about this is Janet Soskis, who was here at the last lecture. She asked John Polkinghorne a question, because she points out, what do religion and science have in common? They are both, first of all, reality depicting. They are both reality depicting, and they both set up models of how they function and what they are. And she looks very carefully at those models and what is legitimate for the scientific quest based on the scientific model, and what is legitimate for religious investigators and so on, and what is legitimate and what is not legitimate, and where they are trespassing on one another's territory. You cannot take a religious model and turn it into an equation. That is not a weakness in the study of religion, it is the way things are. And much as I like the ability of Richard Hawkins to stir up hornets' nests, he does sometimes trespass in areas where scientists should not legitimately tread. What do religions have in common? They have a focus, they have a focal point, but that is not necessarily about God. It's not necessarily theistic. The focal point of Buddhism is nirvana. Hindu philosophy, one important strand of it is Brahman. Those are not theistic. So we have to find another word and say the focus of religion generally is divine, or I've suggested trans-divine. There has to be some sort of focus, but it doesn't necessarily have to be theistic. And also it's important to recognize that religion functions in different levels of human experience, and we in the West, most of us, tend to emphasize doctrine and ethics. But when you look at South Asian religions, sometimes it's the social, ritual and experiential dimensions that are more important, and they are not so bothered about doctrine and ethics. The social dimension of the Hindu tradition, caste, for example. Yes, I know caste discrimination is illegal in India, fine. But you look at the marriage advertisements in the Sunday newspapers. This young Brahmin, young man who is an astrophysicist in Delhi University, he wants a wife. He's reached the age where a wife should be somehow identified. So the advertisement goes, wife should preferably be Brahmin, but if not, a slightly lower caste, then a foreign MBA is very welcome. She might be a Christian, but if she's a Christian, it should be a Christianity that relates to the churches founded allegedly by St. Thomas in the south because he converted Brahmins. Roman Catholics along the west coast are a little bit iffy, but if they're well off and business people, these things are kind of somewhat spoken and partly unspoken, and in the end a suitable person is found and the young people meet, and then the young astrophysicist goes with his parents to the local temple and talks to the astrologer about when the date of the shadi should be. And if you say to him, well look, you're an astrophysicist and you're going to asking an astrologer when you should get married, he will say, it doesn't matter, it's just the way things are. So there are these social dimensions which are still very important, certain levels, with some people more than others. And in my title, I've said Indian tradition, not Hindu, because it seems to me that there are aspects of Indian culture which apply to religion in India right across the board. Hindu, yes. There are more Muslims in India than in Pakistan. Christianity was in India when we in these islands were still dancing around with woad on our faces, long before the word Christianity came here. And there are aspects of Indian culture which apply right across the board. I shall be giving you an example of how Darwinian evolution was welcomed in India for reasons, but it was not only welcomed by Hindus, because humans and animals have a common ancestor according to the Hindu tradition, but Christians also welcomed it. They had none of the problems and hang-ups that people had in England at that time. Next. The Hindu tradition is like a banyan tree. It has no central core. Roots and branches kind of meet with one another without going through the centre. Professor Julius Littner describes it as polycentric, a unity in diversity. I could challenge you to mention any Hindu cardinal doctrine that you think is essential to the Hindu tradition. Caste, reincarnation. Whatever you mention, I believe we could identify a branch of the Hindu tradition which does not believe in that particular so-called cardinal doctrine. An early branch of the Hindu tradition called the Charvakas. We don't know much about them. They did not believe in caste. They said the same red blood flows through everybody's veins, and they did not believe in reincarnation, you see. But they are Hindu, an orthodox Hindu, admittedly, but they are always considered nonetheless to be Hindu. So it's a very mixed collection of traditions, but certain things, the culture is North India geographically, this is where it began. It's like a banyan tree, unity in diversity. And the Hindu scriptures are also vast, but I would argue that the Upanishads are foundational. They're like, you could say that the whole of Indian religion and philosophy is a series of footnotes to the Upanishads. You could say that. But even within the Upanishads, there has been a shift in emphasis. They begin with a kind of moving the gods into the background. The Vedic gods are no longer important, but there is a kind of underlying oneness that is Brahman. And then as time goes on, a figure appears of a sort of god, a lord, Ishvara, in the later Upanishads, the Svetashvatara and so on. So there is a gradation in thought, even within these foundational books. These scriptures are not, they do not point to a religion of the book. It's not like Islam, where one particular piece of literature is very central and very important. There are a number of philosophical traditions, of which the last one is the most important, Vedanta, end of the Vedas, that means, and in particular Shankara is particularly important for particular reasons. That in the 19th century, which we're going to look about in a moment, Shankara's philosophy became particularly important because it enabled Hindus to consolidate their thinking. It enabled them to answer the criticisms of the Westerners and the missionaries, and it also gave them a perspective on what was happening in science. And that's the thing I want to really focus on. However, you will find, if you look at Hinduism or Hindus and science, that sometimes people fasten on other ones of these viewpoints, darshanas they're called, like the Samkhya. It's an evolutionary cosmology. Everything began with three gunas, they're called essences, in total symmetry and total equilibrium. That was the beginning. And then one of them began to move, and then the whole evolutionary cosmology came into being. And that's called the Sankhya. The word means enumeration. Well, some Hindus will say, this evolutionary cosmology, this is what we believe in today. The universe evolved. So the Hindu scriptures are pointing in the right direction. And not only that, I bet you that in one particular journal called Bhavan's Weekly, published from Mumbai, weekly in different languages, very popular. It functions, if I might use an example, rather like the Reader's Digest of Hindu India, you might call it. You can bet that in there will be articles saying, look, here in our Hindu philosophy, here is modern science. Yes, you've got that early symmetry of the universe and Sankhya, and then one of these essences begins to move. That is the Higgs boson. That is the sort of thing that people will be saying. But what I'm saying to you is, don't take this kind of thing too seriously. There is a more serious dimension to do with the coming together of the sciences along the lines that, undergirded by Shankara's philosophy. I won't stop and talk about the language and the Sanskrit and so on, but the Sanskrit is the important language for the Hindu tradition, and it's not easy. Words are conflated together. German is bad enough with long words, Abend, Sonnenschein, but the Sanskrit, you have the whole page put together almost like one long word. And if a word has 3 syllables, And the first one changes according to the phonetic rules, the Sandhi rules, and the last one changes according to the phonetic rules. It's very difficult to say what the word was originally. You've only got one letter to play with. So, but the knowledge of Sanskrit and the meanings of the Sanskrit words, which don't always translate exactly into European languages, is a part of, an important part of the Hindu tradition. Now, why am I going to spend time on the 19th century now? Well, because this is when some Hindu scientists began to really bring together their Hindu beliefs and the best Western science. But also what happened in the 19th century is as important for understanding modern educated Hindus, what is familiar to them, not necessarily what they believe, but what they are familiar with, their culture, their ethos, as it is to understand the English Reformation in order to know what is going on in churches around Cambridge. You cannot walk into Cambridge churches with a Bible and say, now this is what's going on. A lot of things have happened in between, and particularly during the period of the English Reformation and what happened subsequent to it. So the 19th century Renaissance in Hindu thought is crucial for understanding the present day. So I have to just digress and look at this a little while. A crucial event was in 1835, Lord Macaulay, in his official capacity, announced that the English language would be the medium of instruction for all higher education. And with a stroke of his pen, he changed the course of educated Indian history, as some people were able to do historically at certain times. And immediately the floodgates were open among educated Indians, Muslims and Christians, all of them, to all the philosophy, the science, and the literature of Europe. Suddenly it all came flooding in. And of all of this, the science particularly appealed to the educated public. Ram Mohan Roy, the founder of the Brahmo Samaj, the leading Samaj, he welcomed science because he said if Western science has made Europe great, or England great, then it can do the same for India. So let's have Western science, let's have the English language. That is how a lot of these Hindu reformers saw things. But basically what I've done here is I've tried to classify the responses to the West, Western secular thought, literature, philosophy, and science, according to the way Indian, particularly Hindus, but includes Muslims as well, and later Christians, some of them rejected their own tradition right across the board. There were very few in the 19th century who did that, but there were some who didn't particularly identify themselves, but they were criticized by Orthodox Hindus, described them as men without a dharma, Hindus who'd lost their essential definition of who they are. Men without a dharma, one of them said, wading their way to liberalism through tumblers of beer. Well, there weren't many of that category, but some of those who did would have felt that science had taken the place of their religious faith. There were those who reasserted their tradition, the Arya Samaj particularly, and often they did this by saying, look, you Westerners, you say you've got guns, you say you've got aircraft. We have all of those in the Vedic literature. Aircraft, airplane, pushback vimana, yes, we have it there. Guns, yes, we have firearms, we have Agni, the god of fire. And they did this, and it helped to bolster a sort of nationalistic reaction, and it was particularly popular among sort of lower middle class Punjabis and Bengalis, and the movement was led by Dayanand Saraswati, who founded the Arya Samaj, which is still strong and influential. So those are the ones who reasserted the tradition. I think it's probably true to say, some will know better than I do, that you can trace from that Arya Samajist sort of rightist, assertive response a line right through to the Hindu rightists of today, the so-called Sangh Parivar, the political party, Bharatiya Janata Party, and VHP and all the others. But the most interesting ones are the third category, in which the tradition was adapted. And the names I give there are Ram Mohan Roy, I'll show you his picture, and Swami Vivekananda. And they took some of the Western ideas and science and built it in to their own way of thinking. And they produced a sort of intellectual Hindu system that was very strong and resilient. Sometimes it was slightly flawed, but it helped to reassert their beliefs and give them self-confidence and bolster a sort of nationalistic feeling based on religion. Here's Ram Mohan Roy, a fine young man. He died rather young, leader that was actually founded after he died of the Brahmo Samaj. He is the founder of modern India. Not Gandhi, this is the founder of modern India, Ram Mohan Roy. And he was an amazing person. He came to London for the first time, and all the educated, the good and the great knew about the Hindu tradition was widow burning, child marriage, squalor, and all these kinds of things. That is all they knew, and they got this primarily from some missionaries. And some missionaries were very good, and some collaborated with Alexander Duff, worked with Ram Mohan Roy, but on the whole in England at that time they'd given a very negative impression of the Hindu tradition. And then along comes Ram Mohan Roy. He looks dignified, he looks confident. As all educated Hindus were at that time, he was educated first of all in a Muslim madrasa. Don't knock madrasas. He learnt therefore Arabic, Urdu and Persian. He knew those languages and all of that culture. As a Hindu, he had learnt Sanskrit. His mother tongue was Bengali, Hindi of course, and he'd also studied Christianity. He learnt New Testament Greek and published a book called The Precepts of Jesus. And he turned up in London, and people were just amazed at his knowledge, his maturity, his wisdom. So he began to make quite an impression, both in India and whenever he travelled. And there was one Anglican clergyman, the missionaries don't tell you this, but there was one Anglican clergyman who abandoned his Trinitarian beliefs and became a Unitarian as a result of Roy's influence. Now, the reformers and the scientists were very close together. They knew one another, they worked together, they shared the same enthusiasm and growing nationalist beliefs, nascent nationalist beliefs. So here's a scientist, Jagadish Chandra Bose, another Bengali, and he and some of the others I'm going to mention, what they saw in the West and in Western science was very interesting, because it chimed in very precisely with what, as Hindus, in terms of Shankara's particular type of philosophy, seemed to be right and correct and good. What they saw was roughly this. Beginning of the century, the way some of us are taught science and so on in schools, heat, light, sound, electricity, magnetism, botany, zoology, all separate little boxes, you know, taught on different days of the week, and all the rest of it. All separate. Little piece of lodestone hanging up, that's magnetism. A flash in a Leyden jar, that's electrostatic, you see. All separate and all different. But as the century progressed, all of these came together, the understanding of these, under common heads. Electricity and magnetism, electrostatics, James Clerk's Maxwell, light, electromagnetic vibration, even space-time, the Russian Minkowski, before Einstein brought them together. They were all moving together, culminating at the turn of the century with Einstein, with his quest for a unified field theory. So scientists like Jagadish Chandra Bose looked at all this and they said, this is Vedanta. This is multiple phenomena becoming one, slowly progressing to the ultimate truth, that is Brahman. That is how they saw it. And therefore, when they did their science, they were engaged in a religious quest. They were part of this growing together towards the ultimate truth, which holds the universe together. And therefore, Jagadish Chandra Bose, he looked at physiology and physics, he looked at botany and zoology, and he said, well, ultimately these boundaries are not going to exist at all. Botany, zoology, must be the same basic science underlying both. Therefore, he said, I will look for the possibility of pain in plants. Do plants feel pain? You see? If you believe that the boundaries between botany and zoology are not real and will ultimately disappear, you can do that, and that's what he did. Now, the way he did his research was according to the best Western scientific methods. But the fact that he chose this research area was because of his Hindu belief and admiration for Vedanta. And here's Satyendranath Bose, who gave his name to the boson and to Bose-Einstein statistics, working with Einstein on his quest for a unified field theory, because he believed that ultimately all knowledge could come together under one common head. And he worked extensively with Einstein and did some important work on superconductivity, which has connections with bosons. I watched one of these Brian Cox programs 3 weeks ago on the quest for the Higgs boson. And Peter Higgs, who gave his name to it, I think he might have got a mention, but all the photographs were of Edinburgh physicists, none of Edinburgh physicist Peter Higgs, and not a mention at all of Satyendranath Bose, who gave his name to the whole thing. Now I want to turn briefly to Darwinian evolution, because I think the most important thing about this is that it was welcomed in India. There were no problems as there were between church people and science people in England. And I'm saying England deliberately because I don't think the Scots, they were more Hegelian. I think they didn't have quite the same hang-ups that the English churches had at that time. But look at the mood of the educated elite at that time. The third leader of the Brahmo Samaj, the second leader was Debendranath Tagore, the father of Rabindranath Tagore. The third one, look at the way he is writing about science. Science will be your religion, above the Vedas, above the Bible, astronomy, geology, botany and chemistry, anatomy and physiology are the living scriptures of the God of nature. Now, if this is what educated India is responding to, you can't really go wrong if you bring in a new scientific theory. On top of that, for Hindus, humans and animals have a common ancestry anyway. Gods can appear in animal form, reincarnation in theory, though in practice people didn't, I think, believe it at that time. So Darwinian evolution was welcomed amongst the educated elite, and if any of you are subaltern historians, I would just like to say that I have had this research carefully in Bengali, in the Bengali literature, what I'm saying is true there. And also in Urdu, the Delhi College, the Muslim Saeed Ahmed Khan and so on, there were no problems for them about Darwinian evolution. Yes. So there's a Sanskrit word for evolution, parinamaha, and evolution was taken up by Aurobindo and Vivekananda, Swami Vivekananda particularly. And Vivekananda went to the World Parliament of Religions in 1893 in Chicago. See how these people were, confidently taking their message all over the world. And just to give you an idea of his style of approach, 6,000 people, mostly Americans, in Chicago. He was there wearing his ochre robes of a renunciate, and he started off, "Sisters and brothers of America." Everybody stood up and cheered. I don't know why, but they did. And he went on, "I come before you representing a nation and a religion in whose sacred language, the Sanskrit, the word exclusion is untranslatable." Again, they stood up and cheered. "Ye have been told that ye are sinners. Ye are not sinners. Ye are children of the living God. Ye are not sinners. It is a standing libel on human nature to call a person thus." They loved it, you see. But this is very confrontational. Americans at that time were getting tired of the Pilgrim Fathers and their Protestantism, and they were reading Emerson and Thoreau and people like that, so the ground was kind of ready. And in his style of proclaiming the Hindu tradition, he was putting Shankara's philosophy and giving it his own interpretation. Ultimately everything is Brahman, but there are two levels of truth. The high level of truth, everything is Brahman. The lower level, you see through the veil, through the lens of Maya, appears as Ishvara, the Lord, Jivas, or selves, and Jagat, the physical universe. That was Shankara's kind of comprehensive, that was his Vedanta. But Vivekananda gave that a sort of twist and said, well, through the veil of Maya, Brahman is seen as these three. But instead of Maya, he said space-time causation. Well, that was a very progressive and interesting thing to do. I wouldn't say it was correct at all. But he was well aware of the scientific thinking and could talk about it and answer questions. Here's Vivekananda, very confident and progressive person. I think he also exhausted himself and died rather young. Gandhi was not interested in science, but he was a good friend of Tagore, who was. Tagore really knew his science. And Tagore grew out of this crucible that I've been talking about, reformed Hindu belief, science, progressive science, Hindu scientists making great discoveries, and all the rest of what was going on, particularly in Bengal. And Tagore became famous in 1912 when he got the Nobel Prize for Literature. I think it was Gitanjali that got him that prize. And then he was really on the road to international fame. He travelled extensively, and as we'll see in a moment, he met Einstein and they talked together. I just put a note here that he was loyal, he was influenced by Shankara's Vedanta and that highly philosophical kind of approach and interpretation, but he was also very much a humanist in many ways, a Hindu humanist. And in my book here, I begun with a quote which I rather like. The God of humanity has arrived at the gates of the ruined temple of the tribe. The God of humanity has arrived at the gates of the ruined temple of the tribe. The egocentric nationalism that he condemned that was growing in Europe, caste community and family with all the aberrations and awkwardness about this, the sort of thing I was illustrating earlier. The God of humanity has arrived at the gates of the ruined temple of the tribe. That was his kind of clarion call to a lot of young people. They liked that and admired it. And he believed in the universal idea of humanity. Next. Here he is, looking very wise and scholarly, which he was. He was, indeed, he was, in his youth, I think, quite a lonely person. It's interesting, I discovered just recently Wilfred Owen, the First World War poet. Wilfred Owen. I've always been a great admirer of his poems. He died just before the end of the First World War. He was killed in battle. But when his belongings were returned to his mother, she found there, and she wrote to Tagore and said, "I found among his possessions a snatch of one of your poems." So Wilfred Owen had been inspired by Tagore's writings, and tragically he died with a piece of one of his poems among his belongings. Now we're coming to the conversation between Tagore and Einstein. That's not quite right. They first met in 1926, but the first of the 4 conversations was in 1930. I think 3 took place near to Potsdam, where Einstein lived, and the 4th was in the USA. 2 of those conversations are recorded. The second one, there's a dispute over it, because the New York Times has one version, they met in New York, and Einstein has another version of it in German, and they don't quite say the same thing. This illustrates a problem. When Einstein met with Tagore, he spoke in German, which was translated, but Tagore couldn't speak in Bengali. I think if he could have done, there might have been more flexibility in the way he expressed himself, and that may be a reason why these conversations, although they sound very exciting and dramatic, they are a little bit wooden. I've tried to pick out what I think is the central issue between them. Truth is independent of our consciousness. This is Einstein. Nobody's in this house, yet that table remains where it is, this table here. Well, Tagore agrees up to a point. If we all leave this room, this table remains here, fine. But what are the implications if all human consciousness, which Tagore saw as a very collective entity, all human consciousness, what happens if it all disappears? What then is the status of the table? Tagore's understanding of collective human consciousness was inextricably bound up with his understanding of God, you see. So all of that disappears. What then is the status of the table? What is the meaning of the table as an entity? And Tagore believed very much in the centrality of relationship. It was crucial to his understanding. Reality is not based in the substance of things, but in the principle of relationship. Truth is the infinite pursued by metaphysics. Fact is the infinite pursued by science. While reality is the definition of the infinite which relates truth to the person. Reality is human. So, with that kind of perspective, Tagore had difficulty with Einstein's position about the table. Now, Einstein was coming from different directions. I think what Einstein was looking for when he said this, we'll come to Einstein now, a couple of quotes about him. What did Einstein believe in? He was not an atheist. Richard Dawkins is being mischievous when he says that. He wants to claim Einstein on his side. It's as simple as that. behind all the discernible concatenations of nature, he refers to this force beyond anything that we can comprehend, and that is my religion, Einstein says. That's not deism. Deism is God made nature and left it. It's mechanical, it's unfeeling. Einstein was a very passionate person about his religious beliefs. He didn't like the idea of a personal God, because a personal God to him was interventionist and favoured those who believe in him. And he said that's unfair. And there is something to be said for that point of view, but you don't have to see it like that. So Einstein had a very strong belief in God. He wrote very positively about Jesus Christ, very warmly and positively. He liked Spinoza. I think he identified with Spinoza because Spinoza was rejected by Orthodox Judaism at that time, and Einstein also was seen as being a bit iffy by Jews because he did not conform. He would not be bar mitzvatized when he was younger, but that's not essential, but that's another issue altogether. But I think Einstein was looking for bedrock for another reason. These conversations took place in 1930. 1927, Heisenberg had published his uncertainty principle. And Einstein was very uncomfortable with this, because the whole success of Einstein in his two theories of relativity, 1905 and 1915, was based on the fact that he could predict certain astronomical events with amazing accuracy. The orbit of Mercury slews round, he said, by 43 seconds of arc per year. They measured it, it was exactly 43 seconds of arc. Amazing. If that's not proof for a theory, then what is? So prediction was crucial for Einstein. But now uncertainty, quantum mechanics, you can't know, events are random. He was uncomfortable with this. So it's another reason why he would have been feeling for bedrock, for certainty. The table is an entity, it exists, and this is reality, and so on. So that's the sort of way I would interpret his reaction and his mood. But I have mentioned that he had a lot in common with Schleiermacher, German of course, wrote and spoke in German. And the comment I've made attributed to Schleiermacher is something which would find common ground very quickly and easily with the Hindu belief in the underlying Brahman. Now, finally, to sum up, the sorts of things I've been trying to get across, which I think are very important. The Hindu tradition is unity in diversity, it's polycentric. I think we need to understand that. Of the various systems of philosophy, extensive and vast literature, Shankara became important, and his interpretation, for particular reasons in the 19th century. There was at least people gathered together around his kind of philosophy, looking through the lens of Maya, God, humanity and nature, second level of truth, and then Vivekananda's way of reinterpreting that. The English language was crucial in stimulating the Renaissance in 19th century India among Hindus, and I would also add Muslims and perhaps Christians later. And this growing together of the sciences in the 19th century was understood and interpreted by educated Hindus as evidence of the truth of Vedanta. And this gave them self-confidence, it strengthened their national feelings, it gave them determination to quarrel with the missionaries, who often couldn't answer debates at this kind of level. And of course the unified field theory of Einstein was just what they were looking for. And so Satyendranath Bose worked very happily and enthusiastically with Einstein, partly for religious reasons. Darwinian evolution was welcomed, for the reasons I've given, And finally, the Einstein-Tagore conversations, I would like to see them broadened and perhaps not about the reality so much of this table. I'd like to see some other people there. I'd like to see Niels Bohr sitting next to Einstein, because he had some time for quantum statistics and a way of looking at fundamental particles which was different from Einstein's, potentially real, that sort of thing. I'd like to see Niels Bohr sitting next to Einstein, and on the Hindu side I'd like to see Tagore, because I like him particularly because of his humanistic emphasis. That's what appeals to me, bringing religion down to earth but still talking about love and devotion and all the rest of it. I'd like to see Shankara and Ramanuja, who I haven't had time to talk about, sitting next to him. And I'd like to see them discussing not so much the reality of this table, but what it means to be truly human in the light of rapid scientific and technological progress. Science and technology are pushing the pace of change. How do we remain human, truly human, in the best possible sense, in that situation? I'd like to hear them all debating about that.
Thank you very much, David. Well, I'm sure that stimulated some questions. We've got a good time for discussions, so over to you for questions and discussion, Peter. Yes, thank you.
I was fascinated by how often you used terms to do with language. So I remember when I was under Professor David Bowman, he felt that one of the snags with physics was that English and the grammar structure of English didn't actually fit physics. And he suggested a whole new grammar, in effect, which he called the hollow mode, which got rid of some of the inconsistencies that you get when you think of particles as being point things and waves as being something else. So if the Indian languages looked at things a different way, you could see how they could meld in with physics of the time. I'm fascinated by that.
Yes, I think we have to avoid the assertiveness of too much yes or no in our language. Certain Asian languages, Thai for example, they have another word you can use, plough. First of all, you can't say yes or no in Thai. You have to repeat or negate the verb. But there's another word, you say plough, which means unask the question. And it's polite. You're not being rude if you say, you say, your question is based on a wrong assumption, please kindly ask it again. And that is built into the language structure. You see, when I was talking about Einstein just now, people often quote, his question, does God play dice? He didn't say that. He said, first of all, he said, does Der Alte play dice? Does the old one? Maybe it was a joke. Maybe it was a joke. How much theology would change if we considered that sometimes Jesus was joking. But does Der Alte play dice? But then underlying that, does he play dice or does he not play dice? No, this is the wrong way to look at it. He was uncomfortable with the reality. He wanted bedrock because he was uncomfortable with the inability to predict, you see. That's not a yes or no answer. That's a good point.
Yes, please.
You referred to the concept of Maya. I heard about that the first time I was reading about justice and how the Greeks discussed justice. Could you expand a little bit more on the concept of Maya? I don't think I understood it very well.
Could you also repeat the question, David, for those in the back?
Yes, the question is about the concept of Maya in the Hindu tradition. It's got basically two meanings. One is to do with the creative principle. The other one is it appears to be a sort of lens through which we humans look at reality. And the fact that what appears to be one thing can in fact be something else. Shankara used the illusion that a serpent may look like a rope, but actually it's a serpent, but they can look the same, appearance and reality. That's the sort of meaning of the word Maya. The one thing I do want to say, and it's very unfortunate that in Tagore's discussions with Einstein, he actually makes it's not a mistake, but it's just clumsy use of English language, back to your point. Maya does not mean illusion. That is the most important thing to remember about it. It does not mean. It is real, a thing is real. But the serpent and the rope, it is really a serpent, but it looks like a rope, or the other way around, you see. And for Shankara, Maya was primarily that fact of the universe whereby what is ultimately Brahman, the one, unchanging, undefinable and all the rest of it. The word Brahman grows from a Sanskrit root which means to grow, bra. Appears to be God, humanity and nature. Because of Maya, we think of God, humanity and nature as being discrete. I think that's the best answer I can give. What is Maya?
Yes, please, yes.
May I just add, just to that comment on Maya? Shankara definitely said what you just said, but he also used analogies which definitely reinforce the idea of illusion. For creation, he used the analogy of a magician and magic. And the common popular understanding of Maya has done a lot of damage in India. And Tagore was very uncomfortable with it. And he and his Bengali reformers started infusing new meanings into the interpretation of Shankara. Particularly Vivekananda, he did it a lot. And Tagore, in his poetry, definitely speaks in a way which I don't think Shankara would have recognized at all. He speaks against all the idea of renunciation. He redefines it as what it is.
Yes.
He redefines what it is to feel, and it's not to give up feeling, but it's to refine feeling. It's not to give up things, but to redirect them. He completely redefines everything. So he travels a long way away from Shankara. So I think the popular perception has some ground in some of the analogies and some of the arguments that Shankara and his other people used.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's really... Do you follow Bengali?
No, I'm from Tamil Nadu.
No, okay. Well, it's just that, again, it's this question of language. I think those who understand Bengali would be able to add something to, what I've been saying. And Tagore, his first language was Bengali, and this, I think, was how he always preferred to express himself. But thank you very much for that.
Please, yes.
In the text of Hindu thought at one stage, it says that all this sort of scientific investigation covers many fields and is a celebration, as it were, of the god of nature. I found this a little bit confusing because I always think of nature as a rather Western concept. And it seems to be bringing together God and science in a rather sort of unusual way. Can you know the text I'm referring to?
No, I don't.
Well, it was on the screen. Oh, it was on the screen. It was one of the pages.
Oh, yes.
No, before. No, before
Yeah.
that, I think. Yeah, the God of nature, yes. I found that a little bit. I mean, everything else I was happy with in this talk. I just found it's a quotation, isn't it? It's not something you say.
Yes, it's
Science will be your religion. And I found the God of nature phrase a little bit puzzling. Yeah. Or is it a kind of joke?
I don't think with Keshav it would be a joke. The tradition, I mean the Hindu tradition, is that all knowledge is integrated and all knowledge is one, and therefore nature should not be traditionally separated out in the way that this quotation implies. But Keshav Chandra Sen, I think you can probably confirm this, he got rather confused towards the end of his life and very syncretistic. I've kept away from Aurobindo because I'm uncomfortable with some of his thinking. I don't want to tread on any toes, but he seems to me that sometimes he's borrowing from unacknowledged Western sources. And while this may be legitimate up to a point, it confuses the argument. So I've kept away from Aurobindo, who was very strong on evolution.
Well, can I just follow up, just to be quite clear? So, but in this phrase here, the living scriptures are the God of nature, I think the point is it sounds like a sort of theistic Western kind of Christian statement,
Yes.
doesn't it? That's how it sounds. But do you think that's simply because we're reading, you know, G with a God with a big G as if he's some transcendent being, and that thought is not really there in the thought of Sen? Is that how you would take that?
I think so, yes. I think
Yeah.
that's a fair comment on it, yes.
Okay. Please, yes. Yes, please.
I'm interested at do you know much about the modern program in physics research in India? How would you say the approach is different from how the Westerners approach physics these days? Because I'm assuming that, I hope, there will be some sort of influence that's left by these people on the current researcher who's doing research in India.
Well, I think it's a difficult question because India is now very vast and very diverse. We had a speaker here from Tamil Nadu some months ago. He could answer your question from that perspective of South India. I think you'd have to find certain prominent physicists, Indian physicists, who are still alive, such as Jayant Narlikar, who is an astrophysicist. And the fact that why did he choose astrophysics? I don't know what he'd say, but this is the kind of way you could get an answer to that question. The other really famous ones, I think, have mostly died. Yes.
I'm a physicist. Perhaps I could help.
Yes.
Modern particle physicists, at any rate, are operating a completely international way. People from all over the world just work on the same experiment, do the same things, have the same arguments, and do everything according to how it's done. Now, what people do in their background would be like saying, does it make any difference if you're a Christian and a physicist? Well, one can try to answer that, but the actual practice of the science is thoroughly internationalized.
I guess what I'm asking is, fundamentally, what kind of direction they see physics is moving towards. That they could have a different conception of potentially how they see whether you think you're wanting to conceive a unified theory or not. That could be completely influenced by your personal conviction as well as your background, because that's not at all clear how that could be done or could not be done. So
Given what we've just heard, I think you'd have to speak to individual physicists and you'd get a lot of different answers.
Sounds like an interesting project for somebody. Okay, we've got a couple more questions here. We'll have one over here and then one over here, yes, and then it might be time to stop, please, yes.
Yes. Prior to the 19th century, was there much of the development of science in India up until that time? Or is it mainly of the missionaries from England that provided science in the universities or the higher educated?
There was a lot of very important science in India before the British arrived and introduced what I've called Western science. It was mostly in astronomy, mathematics and medicine, and they were extremely good in those particular areas. The zero comes from India, went into the Arabic world and eventually finished up in Europe. But what they lacked, it seems, is an experimental method, putting forward theories and testing results and so on. I think that's what the British period introduced into India that was lacking previously.
There's a question over here, please, yes.
Yes, my question was, you started by saying, what is religion? And I
I wondered that in the traditional Western notion of religion, you've got things which are immanent and things which are transcendent, and they don't mix by definition. They are fundamentally different. Whereas in the more Indian traditions, you seem to be saying that there is no fundamental difference between immanence and transcendence. And I wondered if in the end that was a kind of a sticking point, a stumbling block between two ways of approaching what is a religious world or a religious way of living. And it comes back to the consciousness idea about the table, whether it's affected by consciousness or not.
Well, in the Hindu tradition, you have the concept of the macrocosm and the microcosm. You go out there into the cosmic, you see the cosmic Brahman, and this is in passages in the Upanishads. And ultimately, that self, that Brahman, that you are, and it means your inner Atman is the same, ultimately, as the external cosmic Brahman. That is the great secret of the Chandogya. I think that's the only way I can answer it, not so much in immanence and transcendence, but in terms of the macrocosm and the microcosm.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Our time is up. I'm sure there are lots more questions, and please don't forget our speakers' books on the bookstall if you want to follow up on what we've heard today. But let's thank David again for a fascinating talk.